January 15th, 1947. A vacant lot. On the corner of Norton Avenue and 39th Street, South Los Angeles. A residential neighborhood. Children play here. Mothers walk past here. A woman named Betty Bersinger is walking her 3-year-old daughter to a shoe repair shop. It's a cold morning. She glances toward the weeds at the edge of the lot, and she stops. She thinks it's a store mannequin at first. That's what witnesses always say in cases like this, that the mind refuses to process what the eyes are actually seeing. It wasn't a mannequin. This is not a story about Hollywood's golden age. This is the story of what that age was built on top of, the darkness underneath the spotlights. The one murder out of thousands that Los Angeles has never been able to forget or solve. Welcome to Blind Threads. This is the Black Dahlia. Before she was a headline, before she was a nickname, before she became the single most famous murder victim in the history of American crime, she was Elizabeth Short, and she deserves to be known as a person. Elizabeth Ann Short was born July 29, 1924, in Hyde Park, Massachusetts. She was one of 5 daughters. Her father, Cleo Short, disappeared when she was 6, left his car on a bridge, staged what appeared to be a suicide, and started a new life somewhere else. He would resurface years later. Elizabeth would eventually forgive him. That tells you something about who she was. She suffered from asthma as a child and spent winters in warmer climates, Florida and eventually California. She was drawn to the movies the way a lot of young women of her generation were. Hollywood wasn't just a place, it was a promise, a way out of ordinary, a version of yourself that the world would finally see. By her early 20s, Elizabeth had moved between Florida, California, and Massachusetts several times. She worked waitressing jobs, took in the USO scene, dated soldiers. She was described by everyone who knew her as warm, gentle, and lovely. The kind of person who lit up a room not by demanding attention, but by genuinely caring about the people in it. In the fall of 1946, Elizabeth was living in San Diego. She was 22 years old. She had dreams of acting, and she was talking about moving back to Los Angeles. She was last seen alive on January 9, 1947, at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles, where a man named Robert Manley dropped her off after driving her up from San Diego. She walked through the lobby. She stepped outside. 6 days later, Betty Bersinger found her body. What Betty Bersinger discovered that morning was unlike anything the Los Angeles Police Department or any police department had ever documented. And they had seen a great deal. Elizabeth Short's body had been completely drained of blood. She had been precisely bisected at the waist, severed into 2 halves, with the cuts so clean that the coroner later noted they appeared to have been made with surgical or near-surgical precision. The body had been scrubbed, washed, posed. The 2 halves had been placed 3 feet apart, positioned face up, with the arms raised above the head. There was no blood at the scene. None. Not a drop. The killer had not murdered Elizabeth here. He had displayed her here. There were additional injuries, cuts on the face, rope marks on the wrists and ankles, evidence of extended trauma. The coroner determines that the cause of death was hemorrhage from the lacerations to the face, combined with the physical assault she suffered while still alive. She had been held, tortured, and killed somewhere else, then transported and staged. The LAPD had never seen anything like it. Reporters who covered the crime scene that morning, a few of whom arrived before the body was properly secured, would carry the images of what they saw to their graves. The newspapers named her the Black Dahlia. Nobody knows for certain where the nickname came from. Most historians attribute it to a reporter at the Los Angeles Examiner who combined a popular film noir of the era, the Blue Dahlia, with her reputation for wearing black clothing. The name stuck. Within 24 hours, it was on the front page of every paper in California. Elizabeth Short became famous in death. The story consumed the city. And the LAPD, under enormous public pressure, with dozens of reporters breathing down their necks, had almost nothing to go on. The Black Dahlia murder investigation became the largest in Los Angeles history up to that point. Hundreds of LAPD officers were involved. Thousands of tips poured in. The phones at the Examiner rang around the clock. Over the course of the investigation, police formally questioned more than 150 suspects. Not one was ever charged. The case had serious problems from the start. The crime scene on Norton Avenue had been compromised before investigators arrived. Civilians had walked through it, reporters had gotten close, evidence had been disturbed. And in 1947, forensic science was a fraction of what it is today. No DNA, no digital databases, no surveillance footage. The killer had left a meticulously cleaned body and virtually nothing else. Police identified Elizabeth through her fingerprints. She had been fingerprinted during wartime as part of a civilian defense registration program. Once they had her name, the investigation moved to trace her final days. Robert Manley, known as Red, the man who had driven her to the Biltmore 6 days earlier, was the first major person of interest. He was a married traveling salesman who had met Elizabeth in San Diego. He passed 2 polygraph tests. Multiple witnesses confirmed his alibi for the nights in question. He was cleared, though the experience destroyed his mental health, and he was eventually committed to a psychiatric facility years later, a broken man. The trail went cold at the Biltmore Hotel lobby. Multiple witnesses confirmed seeing Elizabeth there the evening of January 9th. A lobby clerk remembered her making phone calls. A bellhop recalled her waiting near the entrance. And then, nothing. She walked out the door, and the next confirmed account of her location is 6 days later, in a vacant lot 4 miles away. Those 6 days have never been explained. No witness has ever credibly placed Elizabeth Short anywhere between January 9th and January 15th. Wherever she was, whoever she was with, that person has never been identified. Over 75 years, this case has generated more suspect theories than almost any other unsolved murder in American history. Self-confessed killers, deathbed confessions, books, documentaries, family members turning in their own relatives. We are going to look at the 4 most serious suspects, the ones who have actually held up under scrutiny. Suspect 1. Dr. George Hodel. George Hodel was a prominent Los Angeles physician in the 1940s, brilliant, charismatic, and deeply disturbing in ways that only became clear decades later. He was named as a suspect by his own son, LAPD homicide detective Steve Hodel, who spent years investigating his father after his death and published his findings in a 2003 book called Black Dahlia Avenger. Steve Hodel discovered that his father had been under LAPD surveillance in 1949, 2 years after the murder, in connection with a separate criminal matter. Investigators had placed a listening device inside George Hodel's Soughton house in the Hollywood Hills. The transcripts, which Steve Hodel obtained decades later, contain a passage that reads, "Supposin' I did kill the Black Dahlia. They couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore, because she's dead." George Hodel had trained as a surgeon. He had the anatomical knowledge to perform the bisection documented in the autopsy. He had connections to the surrealist art world. Steve Hodel argues the body's positioning mirrored works by Man Ray, whom his father knew personally, and his Soughton house, a striking, fortress-like Frank Lloyd Wright Jr. structure, had a basement room whose layout Steve Hodel argues is consistent with where Elizabeth was held. George Hodel fled the United States for Asia in 1950, shortly after the surveillance operation. He never returned to live in America. He died in 1999 at age 91. He was never charged. Suspect 2. Walter Bailey. Walter Bailey was a surgeon who lived 1 block from the discovery site on Norton Avenue. He had recently separated from his wife. His daughter was a close friend of Elizabeth Short's sister. He had the anatomical skill the murder required, and he was dying. Diagnosed with a degenerative brain disease in late 1946, he died just over a year after the murder. His proximity to the dump site, his surgical background, and his personal connections to Elizabeth's social circle make him a credible person of interest. However, he was never formally investigated as a suspect during his lifetime, and no physical evidence has ever connected him to the crime. Suspect 3. Mark Hansen. Mark Hansen was a nightclub and theater owner who had allowed Elizabeth to stay at his home on Carlos Avenue in Hollywood during 1946. Investigators noted that he had a possessive interest in Elizabeth and had become controlling when she rebuffed his romantic advances. His address book was found among Elizabeth's belongings. Its presence there has never been fully explained. He was interviewed multiple times by LAPD. He was never ruled out and never charged. Suspect 4. Jack Anderson Wilson, named in 1991. In 1991, a retired LAPD detective named John St. John, known as Jigsaw John for his ability to piece together cold cases, became convinced that a drifter and career criminal named Jack Anderson Wilson was responsible. Wilson had connections to several unsolved murders in the 1940s. He matched physical descriptions given by witnesses who claimed to have seen Elizabeth Short with a man in the days before her murder. Wilson died in a hotel fire in 1982, 9 years before St. John could formally present his case. The LAPD has never officially confirmed Wilson as a suspect. The case remains open. January 24, 1947. 9 days after the body was found, the Los Angeles Examiner receives a package in the mail. Inside, Elizabeth Short's birth certificate, her social security card, newspaper clippings about the case, and a note. Here is Dahlia's belongings, letter to follow. The items had been soaked in gasoline before being mailed, an attempt to destroy any fingerprints or trace evidence. It worked. The FBI processed the envelope and contents and recovered nothing usable. The promised follow-up letter arrived several days later. It was rambling, taunting the police, referencing the murder obliquely, demanding coverage. Handwriting analysts compared it to hundreds of samples. No match was ever confirmed. What made this package extraordinary was not just what was in it. It was the fact that Elizabeth's possessions, her identification documents, had been with whoever killed her. This was not a copycat, not a crank caller. This was the person who took her, and they had chosen, deliberately, to reach out, to participate. The same impulse that drove the Zodiac to write letters, the same compulsion toward performance and recognition. The killer of Elizabeth Short wanted the world to know he had done it. He just never wanted the world to know who he was. So here is where we stand, 78 years later. Elizabeth Short was 22 years old. She had never been arrested, never been in any serious trouble. She was trying to build a life in a city that consumed more young women than it ever made famous. She trusted the wrong person at some point between January 9th and January 15th, 1947, and that person has never been identified. The LAPD officially investigated over 150 suspects, received tens of thousands of tips, processed hundreds of letters, including 60 false confessions from people who claimed to be the killer. The FBI was involved, the press was involved. The entire city of Los Angeles was looking. Nobody was ever charged. Nobody was ever convicted. The case file remains open. George Hodel remains the most credible named suspect. His own son, a trained detective, has spent decades building the case. The LAPD surveillance transcript is real and documented, but a transcript is not a conviction, and George Hodel died at 91, having never been formally charged with anything related to the murder. The 6 days between the Biltmore and Norton Avenue remain the deepest mystery in this case. If that window is ever explained, if someone, somewhere knows something about where Elizabeth was and who she was with, this case could still, theoretically, be resolved. But the people who knew the most are almost certainly dead. And the truth, if it was ever written down, was soaked in gasoline a long time ago. If you want to go deeper, Steve Hodell's book, Black Dahlia Avenger, is the most exhaustive suspect analysis ever published on this case. The LAPD files on the Black Dahlia murder are partially available through the California Public Records Act, and the Los Angeles Times archive has every front page from January and February 1947. Subscribe to Blind Threads, new case file every week. Some solved, some not, all real. Drop a comment below. Who do you think killed Elizabeth Short? And what unsolved case do you want us to open next? Unsolved.